Mark stood outside the venue, clutching a small box that used to mean everything. The white ribbon fluttered in the soft breeze like it was trying to fly away, just like she did. Alicia had returned every single thing he gave her. Gifts he'd spent hours picking, weeks saving for, and months associating with the idea of forever. Now they sat in a cardboard box, jewelry, perfume, that red silk scarf from Italy, and even that book she once cried over. He found it in his mailbox with a sticky note that just said, "Thanks, but no thanks." He wasn't even angry anymore. Just empty. The wedding invite had arrived a week after she gave the gifts back. Mark hadn't expected it. Hell, he wasn't sure if it was a joke. It came with golden embossing and a photo of Alicia, laughing, held by Joshua, the guy she always said was just a friend. Mark didn't RSVP, he didn't need to. He knew he'd be there, not for her, not for Joshua, but for himself. So, here he was, standing outside a wedding he wasn't invited to, wearing the same suit he wore on their 3rd anniversary. He still remembered the way she whispered, "This is the night I'll remember forever," back then. Turned out she remembered it just long enough to find someone better. Mark walked through the open gate like he belonged there. No one stopped him. Why would they? He looked sharp, confident, calm. A guy holding a small wrapped box never looks suspicious. Inside, everything was white, gold, and painfully perfect. Flowers in vases, strings of fairy lights. Laughter from people who didn't know the man who was supposed to be the groom once had a panic attack on a park bench while thinking about proposing. He scanned the crowd until he saw Edna, one of Alicia's bridesmaids. She used to joke with him, even liked him more than Joshua, he could tell. She wore a pale green dress and had her hair up in some kind of fancy knot. She looked surprised when he walked up. "Mark," she said, blinking. He smiled. "Hey, Edna. You look amazing." "What are you doing here?" Instead of answering, he handed her the box. "Something small. For the bridesmaids." She looked down, confused, then unwrapped it carefully. Inside was the delicate charm bracelet he'd once given Alicia on Valentine's Day. She gave it back, he said with a shrug. "No use keeping it." Edna glanced up, unsure whether to laugh or feel insulted. He didn't wait for her reaction. Just pulled out another item from the tote bag slung over his shoulder, a luxury perfume bottle. It still had the tag. Next bridesmaid. Tall, dark curls, someone he didn't know. He walked straight up to her and smiled. "For you. A gift." She looked startled, but pleased. "Oh, thank you." "It used to belong to the bride," he said simply, before turning to the next one. Each bridesmaid got something. Alicia had returned 7 gifts. There were 7 bridesmaids. When he reached the last one, he paused. It was Alicia's cousin, Mia, someone who used to call Mark the only guy who gets her. He handed her the red silk scarf. "Tell her she made it easier this way." By the time Alicia walked out in her dress, Mark was already at the bar, sipping a whiskey, alone. Her eyes found him like a magnet. She stopped in her tracks. He lifted his glass toward her, then he smiled. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't cruel. It was calm, collected, inevitable. Her mouth opened slightly as she noticed what her bridesmaids were wearing. The bracelet, the scarf, the earrings, the scent in the air. Mark didn't wait for her reaction this time either. He walked out before she even reached the end of the aisle. "Let me know when you're ready for part 2. Mark didn't drive home. Right away. He parked his car a few blocks from the venue and sat there in silence, staring at the steering wheel, letting the weight of everything wash over him. He wasn't sad, not exactly. Not in the way he used to be, crying into his pillow at 2 a.m., replaying old voicemails, asking himself what he could have done differently. That phase had come and gone like a bad fever. What he felt now was something colder, a dull ache, like a bruise that wouldn't heal. He leaned back in the seat and let out a long breath. Somewhere in that building, she was probably dancing with Joshua right now. Maybe they'd be doing their first dance, some cheesy slow number Alicia used to say was too basic for real love. Funny how quickly people changed when they wanted to. His phone buzzed. A message from Edna. That was cold, Mark. But damn, it was kind of perfect. He smirked at the screen and put the phone down. There was no malice in what he'd done. He hadn't shouted, hadn't made a scene, hadn't even said anything ugly. He just handed the truth over, piece by piece, gift by gift. It had taken him months to realize he never truly knew Alicia. The girl he loved was a version of her that only existed in his mind, a fantasy stitched together with late-night texts, slow kisses, and promises whispered too easily. The real Alicia was the one who kept secrets, who smiled at Joshua while texting Mark, "I just need time." Now she had her time. Let her spend it however she wanted. He started the engine, but just before he could pull out, a soft knock tapped on his window. He turned to see Edna standing there, still in her bridesmaid dress, holding her heels in one hand and a leather jacket in the other. He rolled the window down. "Did I forget to ruin something else?" She laughed, shaking her head. "Can I get in?" He nodded. She slid into the passenger seat and closed the door with a tired sigh. That whole thing back there? A disaster? Alicia nearly broke down. In the bathroom. Joshua's trying to hold it together like a good little groom, but it's a mess. Mark looked at her sideways. "And you're here instead of in the bridal war zone?" "I needed air," she said, brushing her hair out of her face. "Also, I kinda wanted to say thank you." He raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For doing what all of us were too polite to even think about. You showed her the mirror, Mark. She's been playing this fairy tale game for months, pretending she's the victim of some tragic love story. But you..." Edna paused. "You gave her an ending she earned." Mark let out a small laugh. "Didn't expect applause," she smiled. "Not applauding, just acknowledging the art." They sat in silence for a bit. The radio played something soft in the background. Mark could hear the distant echo of celebration from the venue. Clinking glasses. Laughter, faint music. Edna turned to him. "Do you still love her?" The question hit harder than he expected. He looked out the windshield, chewing the inside of his cheek. "I think I loved the idea of her, the way she made me feel, but not the person she actually is." Edna nodded, slowly. "That's real." He turned to her, finally. "What about you? You always seemed like you didn't buy the Joshua fairy tale either." She scoffed. "I didn't. But Alicia, she's always been the girl who needs to be the center of attention. Joshua worships her. That's all she ever wanted." Mark chuckled. "And I guess I wasn't much of a worshiper." "No, she," said, smirking. "You were a partner. She didn't want a partner." They sat there, the silence now more comfortable, more familiar. "Want to get a drink?" Edna asked suddenly. Mark glanced at her. "You're still in the bridesmaid dress. And you're in a suit that smells like Heartbreak," she shot back. He laughed for real this time. "All right, one drink." He pulled out of the parking spot, leaving the wedding lights behind, fading in the rearview mirror. Part 3, when you're ready. They ended up at a small, dimly lit bar that Mark used to go to before everything got serious with Alicia. Before, the constant date nights, the weekend getaways, the pressure of always being good enough to keep her interest. It was the kind of place where the bartender didn't ask questions, and the booths had worn leather that cracked when you slid in. Edna kicked off her heels the second they sat down and pulled her legs up onto the booth seat, completely unbothered. Mark ordered whiskey again. She went for tequila. Neither of them talked at first, just sipped and let the quiet settle. "Did you ever think you'd end up at her wedding like this?" she asked, swirling her drink lazily. He shook his head. "I thought I'd be the one standing up there." Edna made a small sound in her throat, somewhere between sympathy and frustration. "She always does that. Picks people who don't challenge. Her. You challenged her. That scared the hell out of her." Mark stared at the amber swirl in his glass. "Yeah. And somehow Joshua's the reward." "No," Edna said, firm now. "Joshua's the mirror. She's marrying a version of herself. Safe. Predictable. shiny on the outside, hollow underneath. Mark looked up at her, surprised at the harshness. "I thought you two were close." "We were," Edna said, draining the rest of her shot, "until she cheated on you with him and asked me to pretend it never happened." Mark froze. His voice was a low whisper. "She what?" Edna blinked, realizing he didn't know. "Wait, you didn't know?" "Mark, No, I didn't know," he said quietly, setting his glass down like it was suddenly too heavy. "She told me she left because we wanted different things, that it just faded." Edna bit her lip. She was lying. It was Joshua. They'd been sneaking around for at least a month before she ended things. Mark stared at her, eyes narrowing like the whole bar had just shifted sideways. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know the truth. I didn't say anything back then because I thought you knew. I figured you just didn't want to deal with it publicly. But seeing you today, the way you handled it all, I couldn't stay quiet anymore." He leaned back, running a hand down his face, letting out a breath that felt like it came from somewhere deep in his chest. Betrayal had a way of showing up late, knocking twice just to make sure it was heard. "I was planning to propose," he said suddenly. "The night she broke up with me, I had the ring in my coat pocket." Edna's eyes softened, and for a moment she didn't say anything. "She didn't deserve that," she said quietly. "No," Mark agreed. "But I did." The silence grew heavier between them, thicker than before, like they were both sifting through pieces of something broken that never should have been cracked in the first place. "Did she ever tell you why?" he asked. "Why Joshua?" Edna gave a dry laugh. "Because he's easy. He doesn't ask too many questions. He lets her be the star of the show. You asked her to be real, that's what broke it." Mark nodded, eyes distant now. "Funny. I thought love was supposed to want the real parts." "It is," she said. "But she wasn't ready to be loved like that." He looked over at her. She wasn't just Alicia's bridesmaid now. She wasn't the girl who used to crack jokes at awkward dinners or side-eye Joshua during game nights. She was something else entirely, honest, raw, real. "Why didn't we ever talk like this before?" he asked. "Because you were too busy orbiting Alicia's world," she said with a shrug. "Now you're free of gravity." Mark cracked a tired smile. "That's supposed to be deep?" "No," she grinned. "Just slightly buzzed." They sat there, the low hum of jazz playing in the background, the world quieter now that all the illusions were gone. Outside, the night had stretched out, full of quiet streets and distant headlights. Neither of them moved. They didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, Mark didn't feel lost. He just felt done. The next morning hit Mark like a slow-moving freight train. No chaos, no panic, just a heavy, unshakable weight in his chest. Sunlight filtered through his half-drawn curtains, and for a second, he forgot everything. Then he turned his head and saw the suit jacket draped over the chair, and it all came flooding back. He wasn't hungover, not really. One whiskey, one beer. That was it. But the emotional hangover? That was brutal. He sat up, rubbed his face, and checked his phone. No messages from Alicia, none from Joshua, but Edna had texted. "You all right?" He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. "Yeah." Surprisingly. Then, after a pause, "Thanks for last night," she replied almost instantly. Felt like a long time coming. You were owed the truth. And honestly, it felt good to say it out loud. Mark tossed the phone onto the bed and got up. He didn't want to waste the day sulking. That part of his life was over, and he didn't want to become one of those sad exes who keep circling the same grief, hoping for a different shape. Alicia was married now. Done. Her story had taken a different road, and he wasn't in it anymore. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her face when she saw the bridesmaids. That flicker of realization, regret, maybe, confusion, probably. But most of all, she looked exposed, like someone had read her diary out loud to a room full of strangers. Mark wasn't proud of what he did, but he didn't regret it either. Later that day, Edna called. Not texted, called. That felt rare enough to matter. "You busy?" she asked when he answered. "Not really. Come with me." "To where?" "Closure." He raised an eyebrow even though she couldn't see it. "That's vague as hell." "Trust me," she said, a little amused, a little serious. So he did. They met at a quiet cafe downtown. Edna was already sitting at a patio table, sunglasses on, sipping something iced and way too green to be anything he'd order. She stood, when she saw him, offered a brief smile and held up a manila folder. "What's that?" She handed it to him. "Pictures, screenshots, messages. All of it." He opened the folder slowly. There it was. Proof. Alicia and Joshua's messages. From before the breakup. The ones Edna said existed but he hadn't asked to see. Now he saw them all. He sat up, rubbed his face, and checked his phone. No messages. From Alicia. None from Joshua. But Edna had texted, "You all right?" He stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. "Yeah." Surprisingly. Then, after a pause, "Thanks for last night," she replied almost instantly. "Felt like a long time coming. You were owed the truth. And honestly, it felt good to say it out loud." Mark tossed the phone onto the bed and got up. He didn't want to waste the day sulking. That part of his life was over. And he didn't want to become one of those sad exes who keep circling the same grief, hoping for a different shape. Alicia was married now. Done. Her story had taken a different road, and he wasn't in it anymore. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her face when she saw the bridesmaids. That flicker of realization, regret, maybe, confusion, probably. But most of all, she looked exposed, like someone had read her diary out loud to a room full of strangers. Mark wasn't proud of what he did, but he didn't regret it either. Later that day, Edna called. Not texted, called. That felt rare enough to matter. "You busy?" she asked when he answered. "Not really. Come with me." "To where?" "Closure." He raised an eyebrow even though she couldn't see it. "That's vague as hell." "Trust me," she said, a little amused, a little serious. So he did. They met at a quiet cafe downtown. Edna was already sitting at a patio table, sunglasses on, sipping something iced and way too green to be anything he'd order. She stood, when she saw him, offered a brief smile and held up a manila folder. "What's that?" She handed it to him. Pictures, screenshots, messages. All of it. He opened the folder slowly. There it was. Proof. Alicia and Joshua's messages. From before the breakup. The ones Edna said existed but he hadn't asked to see. Now he saw them all. A few days passed and Mark found himself moving differently. The air felt lighter. Songs didn't sting the way they used to. Even his apartment, once filled with echoes of her, began to feel like it actually belonged to him again. He boxed up the last of Alicia's things, the few bits she hadn't, had the decency to collect herself and set them by the front door. Not for her. Just to remind himself it was over. It was strange, the way endings had a way of unfolding even after the main event. Her wedding was done, vows spoken, rings exchanged, but the fallout, the emotional residue, still lingered in quiet places. In toothbrush holders, in playlist names, in drawers where her handwriting used to live on little notes that said, "Love you, even on Mondays." He trashed the notes. He changed the playlist name. Progress. On a Wednesday afternoon, he got a call he didn't expect. It was Joshua. Mark stared at the caller ID for a long time before answering. Part of him didn't want to hear that voice, too smooth, too rehearsed, but curiosity overpowered pride. He answered with a flat, "Hello?" There was a beat of silence on the other end, then a familiar voice said, "Hey, it's Josh." Mark didn't say anything. Joshua cleared his throat. "Look, man, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, but I needed to say something. Mark leaned back in his chair, letting the tension settle in his shoulders. Then say it. I didn't plan for any of this, Joshua said quickly. It just happened. She and we got close, and I should have had the balls to come clean earlier. I was a coward, and I don't expect forgiveness or anything like that. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. Mark let the silence stretch. He didn't owe Joshua anything, not a kind word, not even acknowledgement. But maybe this wasn't for Joshua. Maybe it was just another piece falling into place. One more, not loosening. He finally said, You know, it wasn't just that you slept with her, it was that you pretended to be my friend while doing it. Joshua was quiet. Then softly, Yeah, I know. You could have told me, Mark added, voice. Even, you didn't. You waited until she was in a white dress to own up. I was scared, Joshua admitted. Of how I'd look, of what I'd lose. Mark almost laughed. And now you're married to her, so congrats, I guess. Joshua gave a breathy, awkward chuckle. Yeah, guess I am. Mark let a few seconds pass before saying, You'll learn what it's like to never fully trust someone, to wonder if she's texting someone else, to live with the question you once helped her answer. That's your life now. It wasn't bitter. It was just the truth. Joshua didn't argue. I wish it had gone differently, he said finally. So did I, Mark replied. But it didn't. So don't call again. And with that, he hung up. He sat there afterward staring at his phone, expecting some kind of shaking or anger to boil over. But nothing came. It was just quiet, like his heart had finally stopped, waiting for an apology. That night, Edna texted again. Up for a walk? He met her near the riverfront. The sky was streaked with the last colors of sunset, pinks and purples fading into something calmer. She was already there, leaning over the rail, tossing little stones into the water. Figured you'd need air, she said without turning. You psychic or something? No, just female. We noticed the storms before you guys admit they're coming. He laughed and leaned beside her. Joshua called. She looked over sharply. What did he say? Everything I already knew. Nothing I needed. Edna nodded. That's what cowards do. They explain themselves too late. They walked quietly for a while, the gravel crunching under their feet. You still have the ring? She asked suddenly. He smirked. Yeah. Why? She shrugged. Just wondering. They stopped near a bench. She sat. He sat beside her, and for a while neither of them spoke, until Edna said, You know, you didn't just lose her. You found yourself. Mark looked at her. And what if I don't know what to do with that? She smiled. Then you let someone show you. Mark hadn't expected the way that line would stick with him. Then you let someone show you. It echoed in his head the next morning when he brushed his teeth, when he pulled on his jacket, even when he walked past the ring box he still hadn't decided what to do with. Edna wasn't just saying things to sound wise. She meant it. And that hit harder than any of Alicia's promises ever had. The strange part was how easy things had become between them. No pressure, no pretending, no walking on eggshells like he had in the last months with Alicia, always worried if he was saying too much or not enough. Edna never made him feel like he had to impress her. She didn't flinch at silence or try to fill every moment with fake comfort. That weekend they met again. She texted him in the afternoon. Ever tried throwing plates at a wall for therapy? He replied, No, but I'm interested. Then she sent an address. It was a rage room, the kind where you suit up in padded gear and smash the hell out of dishes, old printers, and glass bottles with a bat while music blares in the background. Mark wasn't sure if it was brilliant or insane. Turns out it was both. They smashed things until they were out of breath, and then they laughed. Mark hadn't laughed like that in months, deep, uncontrolled, ugly laughing that left your chest sore. Edna was ruthless with the baseball bat, and at one point she yelled, "This is for every guy who sent me a wide text at 2 a.m., Mark." Nearly collapsed from laughing. Afterward, they sat on the curb outside with bottled water, both sweaty and grinning. "Feeling better?" she asked. He nodded. "Like I just broke up with my trauma," she smirked. "Next time we set your playlist on fire." He glanced at her. "Was there ever a you and Alicia moment? Like, did she ever think you'd turn on me too?" Edna leaned back, her smile fading a little. "She tried. Told me you were possessive, too serious, controlling even." Mark blinked. "Controlling?" Edna shook her head. "You were the most emotionally available man I'd ever seen her with. That scared her. She didn't know how to hold something stable. She wanted chaos, someone she could bend. You didn't bend." Mark stared off into the distance. "And now I'm left trying to figure out who I am without her." Edna bumped his shoulder gently. "You're Mark, the guy who returned Heartbreak with class, the guy who gifted a bridesmaid perfume like it was nothing, the guy who listens when most men deflect. That guy's still here." He looked at her, really looked at her. "You always this blunt? Only when I care," she said, giving a playful shrug. That moment between them felt different, slower, deeper. They didn't kiss. There was no movie scene music swelling in the background, but something shifted, something small and solid, like the first brick laid down after demolition. Later that night, Mark found himself in his apartment again, staring at the ring box one last time. He opened it, looked at the diamond. It didn't make him feel anything anymore. No hope, no sadness, no what-ifs. It was just a stone. So he stood, walked to the balcony, and flicked it off the edge, not out of anger, but closure. He didn't even stay to watch it fall. He just turned around and shut the door behind him. The next morning, Edna texted, "I had fun yesterday. Let's smash stuff again sometime." Mark replied, "Or maybe just lunch this time?" She responded with a single word, "Finally." Mark didn't dress up for lunch. That was the first clue something had changed in him. No need to impress. No more pretending confidence was a suit you had to wear. He kept it simple. Jeans, a clean tee, and a jacket Alicia once said made him look too rugged. Today, that was exactly the point. Edna picked the place, a tiny Mediterranean cafe tucked between a flower shop and a bookstore. It smelled like grilled lamb, rosemary, and cinnamon. The owner greeted her by name. "How often do you come here?" Mark asked as they sat at a small outdoor table. "Often enough for them to know my drink," she grinned. "Try the lemon mint tea. It tastes like fresh starts," he laughed. "You always talk like a poetic therapist." Edna raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it's a bad thing." "No," Mark said, shaking his head. "It's different, in a good way." They ordered and sat in comfortable silence, watching the city pass by. People walked by laughing, shopping bags swinging, babies crying, normal life. Something he hadn't really noticed in a while. When the food arrived, Edna leaned in a little. "Okay. Real talk now." Mark looked up from his plate. "Uh-oh," she smiled. "You think you're ready?" "For what?" "To move on. For real." He sat back, chewing slowly. He thought about it, about the empty spaces in his life that Alicia used to occupy. They didn't feel like wounds anymore, more like healed over scars, tender but closed. "I think I am," he said honestly. "I'm not waiting for her to text. I'm not comparing every face I see to hers. And I stopped rehearsing that imaginary conversation where she begs for me back." Edna smirked. "That one takes up a lot of mental storage, huh?" "Way too much," he chuckled. They ate a little more, and Mark watched her as she picked apart. Her pita, thoughtful. She was so unlike Alicia. No pretense, no performance. She didn't try to say the right thing, she just said the real thing. "You know what I admire about you?" he said. She looked up, surprised. What's that? You were always her friend, but you never took her side blindly. Edna's eyes softened. I was loyal to her, but I wasn't blind. I watched what she did to you, and it made me question everything. Mark leaned in slightly. Why didn't you say something back then? I almost did, she admitted. One night after a party, I was going to call you, tell you everything, but I knew if I did, she'd cut me off. And back. Then I still thought I needed her. And now? Now I know I don't need anyone who asks me to lie for them. They sat there for a beat too long, the space between them thick with unspoken things. Mark could feel it shift again. Something had been building since the night of the wedding. Slow and careful, not a rebound, not a spark out of pity. Something more grown, more earned. Edna broke the tension. You know, if we ever do date, people are going to think it's scandalous. He laughed. You think I care what people think after I gifted a perfume bottle to a stranger at a wedding? Touché, she grinned. But seriously, he added. I'm not trying to fall into anything too fast. I'm still learning what it means to stand on my own. I respect that, she said, but I'm also not going to pretend I'm not interested. Mark smiled, and this time it wasn't one of those fake polite smiles. It was real, warm, maybe even hopeful. As they left the cafe, he reached for her hand. She didn't hesitate. Their fingers laced easily, naturally, like they'd done this before in another life. No fireworks, no dramatic music. Just two people, walking side by side, finally unburdened. By the time they reached her car, Edna looked up at him and said, So? What now? He squeezed her hand gently. Now we stop looking back. Weeks passed, and life didn't explode with romance or fall into perfect harmony, and that was the best part. There was no movie ending, no grand gestures, just quiet mornings where Mark woke up without the ache in his chest. Just normal days where he didn't flinch at the sound of Alicia's name. That heavy cloud that had once followed him everywhere had slowly thinned out until it was just sky again. He and Edna didn't rush into love. They met for lunch, shared playlists, took long walks, and talked about everything. Childhood regrets, weird dreams, old mistakes. It wasn't always easy. Some days Mark still caught himself staring at the past like it owed him something. Some nights he'd wonder if Joshua ever found out who Alicia really was underneath all the shine. But mostly, he didn't care anymore. One Saturday, Edna invited him to her apartment. It was small, full of mismatched furniture and books in every corner. Plants hung from the ceiling, and a lazy orange cat named Hugo sat on the windowsill, blinking at Mark like he was being evaluated. You never told me you had a cat, he said, cautiously reaching to scratch Hugo's head. Edna shrugged from the kitchen. He doesn't like most people. Don't take it personal if he tries to scratch you. So, he's just like your best friend then? She peeked around the corner and grinned. Exactly. You're not proposing, are you? He smiled. Not yet, just thought we could do something with it. They drove to the same bridge where he'd first met her after Alicia's wedding. The river below sparkled in the moonlight. He handed her the box. Edna opened it, looked at the ring, then looked at him. You sure? Completely. She held it up, then flicked it out into the night. It arced through the air like a weight being lifted. Then it was gone. Mark didn't flinch. He just breathed. Afterward, they sat on the hood of the car side by side, legs dangling over the edge. Quiet, simple, free. Edna leaned her head on his shoulder. You're not the same guy from that wedding day. No, he said, and thank God for that. They made pasta together, badly. The sauce burned, the noodles stuck. They laughed more than they cooked. And when it was finally edible, they ate it sitting on the floor, drinking cheap wine out of mismatched mugs. Mark looked at her over his cup. You think Alicia's happy? Edna thought about it for a second, then shook her head. She might be, but it won't last. People who build their lives on pretending eventually drown in it. He nodded slowly. I don't miss her. I miss who I thought she was. That's okay, Edna said gently. It just means you're human. They didn't talk about feelings after that. They didn't need to. Some truths didn't need to be spoken again and again. They just lived in the silence between heartbeats. A few days later, Mark opened his drawer and found the small velvet ring box, the one he thought he'd tossed from the balcony. Turns out he'd only imagined doing it. It was still there, dusty in the corner like a leftover chapter. He brought it to Edna, held it out. She looked at it carefully. She smiled. So, what now? He tilted his head slightly, thinking. Now, we live, he said, without waiting for someone else to decide if we're enough. She looked at him, and in her eyes, there was something stronger than pity, deeper than romance, respect, admiration, maybe even love, slow and steady like something planted on purpose, not accidentally fallen into. And Mark, finally, felt whole again. Not because someone completed him, but because he'd finally stopped giving his heart to people who didn't know how to hold it.